Some disappearances leave no footprints, only questions whispered by the night. It begins with a journey by train. A lady of fortune steps aboard, yet at the journey's end she is nowhere to be found, her very existence seemingly erased between stations. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now let us draw open the curtain upon this riddle of the rails and follow Holmes into the mystery of the case of the vanishing passenger. It was upon a particularly grey and unwelcoming morning that I found myself once more in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street. A dense fog pressed heavily upon the windows, and the muffled clang of distant hansom cabs echoed dully from the street below. The fire within the grate provided but a modest comfort, throwing a wavering glow upon the scattered piles of newspapers and chemical apparatus that bore silent witness to the peculiar occupations of my remarkable companion. Holmes himself stood before the fireplace, his tall, spare figure half lost in shadow, while his long hands clasped behind his back betrayed a certain nervous energy. His keen eyes, deep set beneath an intellectual brow, darted restlessly from the fire to the fog-laden pane, as though awaiting some new phenomenon to break the monotony of the day. I, for my part, sat with my medical journal unopened upon my lap, my thoughts wandering idly. Yet it required little imagination to perceive that my companion was far from idle in spirit. Even in moments of apparent repose, his mind worked with a ceaseless activity, searching for a puzzle upon which to expend its inexhaustible faculties. There was in the air of that morning an expectancy, though of what I could not tell. And indeed, as I looked upon Holmes's figure, outlined against the fire, I could not have suspected how swiftly the fog of indolence would be pierced by the keen light of his extraordinary deductions. "Your walk this morning has been somewhat longer than usual, Watson," said Holmes, without turning his gaze from the fire. I looked up in astonishment. "How on earth could you know that? I have scarcely spoken since entering the room." He permitted himself a faint smile. "Your coat is still marked with the remnants of damp soil, the hue of which I associate with the embankment near Kensington Gardens. Add to this the soot upon your sleeve, no doubt the product of some waiting-room seat in the vicinity of Victoria Station, and the matter admits of no further doubt. Your journey, though of modest length, required both train and foot, beginning early in the day." I could not but laugh. "Upon my word, Holmes, you make it sound the simplest calculation in the world." "Precisely so," he answered, at last turning those sharp grey eyes upon me. "It is only simple because one is willing to observe what others dismiss as trifling. Mud upon a cuff is no mere accident to the inquiring mind. It is an open volume." I shook my head in admiration, already accustomed, yet never immune to these dazzling displays of his peculiar craft. "You must forgive me, Holmes," I remarked, "for even after so many instances, I still find myself confounded. To me, these are details invisible." "Not invisible, my dear Watson. Merely overlooked," he replied with some crispness. "You see, but you do not observe. It is a failing of most men, and the reason why truth is so often obscured by assumption. Train your faculties to regard nothing as too small for notice, and soon you will perceive what lies beneath the commonplace." There was no vanity in his tone, only the calm authority of one who spoke from long practice, and a supreme command of his method. I confess that I felt, as I so often did in his presence, that my own faculties were but dull instruments beside his finely tuned machinery. Holmes broke off his reflections with a sudden movement, stooping to seize the morning paper from amidst the clutter upon the table. His eye ran swiftly down the columns until it fixed upon a bold headline that sprawled across the page. "Ah, here is something to relieve the tedium," he murmured, smoothing the sheet. "Passenger missing from a moving train. Pray attend, Watson." I leaned forward as he read aloud the particulars. A young lady of respectable appearance had entered a compartment at Reading upon the Great Western Railway. The train arrived punctually at Paddington, yet no trace of her was discovered upon the platform. Her luggage, it was said, remained undisturbed, and the railway authorities could provide no explanation for her mysterious disappearance. The report, written in the florid style of the popular press, dwelt extravagantly upon the supposed terror of the other passengers and hinted darkly at supernatural agencies. Holmes, however, read the account with the utmost composure, pausing only to note the precise wording of certain details. "Observe, Watson," he said at last, tapping the column with his forefinger. "Here we have a puzzle fit for the sharpest of wits, if the facts be true." I confess my curiosity was instantly aroused, for there was in the notion of a vanishing passenger an element of the grotesque which could not fail to excite the imagination. Holmes tossed the paper aside with a gesture of disdain. "The writer indulges in sensational flourishes at the expense of accuracy," said he. "Yet, amid the exaggerations, one perceives an inconsistency." "And that is?" I asked eagerly. "The luggage, Watson. The article insists that her effects were found intact at Paddington, but neglects to mention how the compartment was searched, or whether witnesses observed her alight en route. It is a gap which no competent report would leave." He paced slowly across the room, his hands clasped, his face alight with that keen flame of interest I knew so well. "Such an omission suggests either ignorance or concealment. In either case, we may suspect that beneath this trivial news item lies a matter of greater gravity." Thus spoke Holmes, and though I did not yet comprehend the path his reasoning would follow, I felt instinctively that the fog of that morning had lifted upon the threshold of a singular adventure. It was shortly after Holmes had cast aside the morning paper that the sound of hurried steps upon the stair announced the arrival of a visitor. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson ushered into our sitting room a gentleman whose pale and anxious countenance bespoke the urgency of his errand. He was a man of middle years, plainly dressed, yet there was about him an air of official precision. His gloved hands twisted nervously together, and the perspiration upon his brow betrayed a deep agitation. He bowed hurriedly, casting quick glances towards Holmes, as though measuring the reception he might expect. "My name is Edward Hatherley, sir," he began, his voice unsteady. "I serve as an officer in the employ of the Great Western Railway, and I come to you under the gravest perplexity. A calamity has occurred of such singular nature that, though the police are apprised, I felt compelled to seek your counsel." Holmes inclined his head with that quiet courtesy which never deserted him. "Pray be seated, Mr. Hatherley," said he. "Compose yourself, and state the facts as clearly as you may. You will find in Dr. Watson and myself attentive listeners." The official sank into the armchair, though he seemed scarcely able to remain still, and his restless hands betrayed the agitation that his words would soon reveal. "Yesterday afternoon," said Hatherley, "a young lady of distinction entered a compartment of the express train from Reading to Paddington. She was observed by the guard and by several fellow passengers, and nothing in her bearing suggested distress or reluctance. Yet upon the arrival of the train at Paddington, the lady was nowhere to be found." Holmes raised his brows slightly, though he made no comment. Hatherley continued, "Her luggage remained untouched in the van. The attendants, upon discovering her absence, conducted a thorough search, yet no sign of her could be obtained. None of the passengers recalled seeing her leave at any intermediate station. It is as though she vanished from the train in transit." "You are certain the luggage was hers?" asked Holmes. "Beyond question. It bore her initials and was deposited at Reading before her departure. We were compelled to inform her family at once, and the matter has caused no small stir amongst the directors of the line." I could not repress a start of astonishment at this strange recital. "And the lady's name?" I asked. "She is Miss Clara Denham," said Hatherley gravely, "a lady of fortune and refinement. The circumstances of her disappearance place both her safety and the honour of the railway in jeopardy." Holmes sat motionless, his eyes fixed keenly upon the speaker, as though each detail fell into some silent system of reasoning within his brain. I confess that the name of Miss Denham was not unfamiliar to me, for society pages had lately made frequent mention of her. She was, by all accounts, the daughter of a wealthy merchant who had left her an ample estate upon his decease. With no near relations save an elder brother, she had moved within circles where both her fortune and her personal grace attracted considerable attention. It was whispered that she had recently formed an attachment, though the identity of her suitor was not publicly confirmed. The combination of her position and her beauty rendered her a figure of no little consequence, and the idea that such a lady could be spirited away in so open a manner seemed to me at once incredible and alarming. The disappearance, if allowed to remain unexplained, could not fail to provoke scandal, not merely upon the young lady's family, but also upon the railway company whose duty it was to ensure her safe passage. "Yet what do the authorities suppose?" asked Holmes at last, his tone measured. Hatherley shifted uneasily. "The police incline to the belief that the lady alighted unobserved at some intermediate stop. They argue she may have wished to conceal her movements, and that no crime need be suspected. In their view, the matter will resolve itself in due course." "And you disagree?" said Holmes quietly. "I do, sir," replied Hatherley with vehemence. "Her brother, Mr. Henry Denham, is adamant that she would never have acted thus. He is convinced that foul play has occurred, and in truth, I cannot dismiss the possibility. The circumstances are too singular, the evidence too meagre. Yet I am powerless to pursue the inquiry further, for my superiors prefer to avoid publicity." Holmes leaned back, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze unwavering. I could see that every fibre of his attention was fixed upon the trembling official, though he uttered not a word. The silence grew oppressive, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Hatherley's eyes darted anxiously from Holmes to myself, as though begging for some assurance that his tale had not fallen upon unheeding ears. At length Holmes rose and crossed to the window, where the fog still pressed gloomily against the panes. When he turned back, there was in his face that keen light which never failed to quicken my pulse, for it heralded the stirrings of his intellect in pursuit of some hidden truth. "Mr. Hatherley," said he, "your company is fortunate to have in you an official not content with superficial explanations. You have done wisely to come here. A lady of distinction does not vanish between Reading and Paddington without leaving behind the faintest trace, unless that trace has been deliberately obscured." Hatherley gave a gasp of relief, while Holmes's eyes gleamed with inward excitement. "Watson," he continued, "there is more here than a mere lapse of attention or a secret elopement. We stand upon the threshold of an inquiry which promises both difficulty and importance. I shall place myself at your service, Mr. Hatherley, and you may assure Mr. Denham that every effort will be made to uncover the truth." Thus spoke my friend, and I knew from the calm authority of his voice that the strange case of the vanishing passenger had secured his full and undivided powers. The following morning saw Holmes and myself upon the Great Western Line, bound for Reading. The fog had lifted somewhat, leaving the sky heavy with a dull pallor that seemed in keeping with the sombre business upon which we were engaged. My companion, as was his habit during journeys of inquiry, preserved an almost unbroken silence. His long, thin fingers drummed lightly upon the armrest, and from time to time his keen eyes wandered across the passing landscape, though I knew full well his gaze was fixed upon images invisible to me. The shifting figures of deduction which already began to take form in his singular mind. For my own part, I confess that curiosity and unease contended within me. The notion of a young lady of station vanishing, as if spirited into the air between Reading and Paddington, struck me as incredible. Yet I had learned to trust implicitly in Holmes's instinct for distinguishing the genuine puzzle from the hollow chimera of gossip. His calm assurance, even in silence, lent me a certain confidence, though I longed for him to share the least of his reflections. At length, he glanced briefly at me. "We must proceed as though every inch of that compartment may speak, if only we learn to hear it," said he. With that enigmatic pronouncement, he relapsed once more into silence, while I watched the smoke trail behind us, as the train bore us swiftly toward the scene of the mystery. Upon arrival at Reading, Holmes wasted no moment in formalities, but proceeded at once to the platform where the ill-fated journey had begun. The railway officials, already apprised of our purpose by Mr. Hatherley, ushered us with deference to the carriage which Miss Denham had occupied. I entered with some trepidation, for the compartment bore the same commonplace appearance as any other upon the line. Yet Holmes's sharp gaze travelled over it with restless intensity, alighting upon features that to my untrained eye seemed utterly devoid of significance. The air within was close, holding the faint odour of stale smoke and damp wool, yet mingled with it, or so I fancied, was a subtler fragrance, delicate and lingering, such as a lady's attire might impart. Holmes bent to examine the cushions, running his long fingers lightly across the worn fabric. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "how the pressure marks upon this seat are not consistent with a single occupant throughout the journey. Here is the impression of a lighter form, there the deeper indentation of one who leaned forward suddenly. There is a story written here, if we but read it." I bent close but could discern only the most ordinary traces. Still, I felt in the very atmosphere of that compartment a peculiar hush, as though it retained some echo of the drama that had passed within its narrow walls. Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming. "It is seldom the stage is left so untouched after the curtain falls," he said softly. "Here, at least, we may be sure the play was enacted." Holmes's next movement was to kneel at the corner of the seat nearest the window. With the delicacy of a surgeon, he plucked from the narrow crevice a tiny shred of black fabric. He held it aloft upon the tip of his finger, and I saw that it was a fragment of gauze or veil, frayed at the edge as though rent by sudden force. "A lady of Miss Denham's refinement would be unlikely to discard such an article carelessly," said Holmes. "This is not the cast-off of a garment, but the remnant of violence. It speaks of a hand too hurried or too rough for courtesy." I felt a chill at his words. That slender fragment, no larger than a coin, seemed transformed in his grasp into a token of menace. The image of Clara Denham, struggling within that narrow space, rose unbidden to my mind. Holmes folded the shred carefully within his notebook. "It is small, Watson, but it is eloquent. The faintest thread may serve to unravel the skein." Having secured the fragment, Holmes turned his attention to the window latch. He bent close, examining the metal with a magnifying lens, his brows drawn in sharp concentration. Presently he indicated to me a faint smear, scarcely visible in the dim light, that lay upon the brass. "Note, Watson, the irregularity of this mark," said he. "It is not the simple trace of a hand in the act of opening, but rather of something pressed against it, something damp or adhesive. It is displaced laterally, suggesting haste, perhaps even compulsion." To my eyes it was little more than a shadow upon the surface, yet I had long ceased to doubt his interpretation of such minutiae. The thought that the very window might have been forced in some desperate encounter filled me with a sense of foreboding. Holmes pocketed his lens. "This latch tells us more than any passenger's recollection. If the lady departed this carriage, it was not by the door in sight of the guard." Holmes, after completing his survey of the compartment, summoned the station officials and questioned them with his customary precision. At length, a porter of modest bearing was produced, who declared that shortly before the train's departure from Reading, he had observed a tall man lingering in the vicinity of the carriage, which Miss Denham was later known to have entered. The fellow's account was halting and uncertain. He could not describe the man's features, save that he was of above-average height and wore a dark coat. When pressed by Holmes as to the man's movements, he admitted that the stranger had seemed to hesitate, as though waiting for someone, and that he had loitered close enough to touch the carriage door, before withdrawing hurriedly at the guard's approach. Holmes regarded him narrowly. "You are sure of nothing more? No peculiarity of gait, of accent, of gesture?" The man shook his head apologetically. "It was but a glimpse, sir." Holmes dismissed him with a nod, but I saw the gleam in his eyes as he turned back to me. "A vague description, Watson, but one that will serve. A shadow upon the threshold is often more eloquent than a portrait. His words carried us forward to the next stage of our inquiry, for the luggage at Paddington remained to be examined. By the following afternoon, we found ourselves once more at Paddington, where the luggage of the missing lady had been placed in safekeeping. Holmes examined the collection with a deliberation that made the officials restless, for to them it appeared wholly ordinary. There were 2 modest valises and a larger trunk, all neatly labelled with the initials CD. The valises contained clothing of plain design, folded with a precision that spoke of careful hands. Yet I could not help but note the absence of those finer adornments which a lady of means might carry. No jewellery case, no silken wraps, nothing to suggest the wealth of their owner. Holmes' keen glance moved from one article to the next, his fingers testing seams, linings, and locks. "There is an austerity here," he murmured, "which is either a mask or an error. We must look deeper." And deeper, indeed, he went when he fixed his attention upon the trunk. The trunk, sturdier than the rest, bore a brass lock of respectable quality. With the station-master's permission, the key was produced and the lid raised before us. Its contents proved to be equally unremarkable: plain garments, serviceable but devoid of luxury, and a few volumes of light literature. Holmes stood for several minutes in silence, turning over each article with fastidious care. Then, closing the lid, he laid his hand upon it with a gesture of finality. "You perceive, Watson, the singular absence of any personal relics. No letters, no trinkets, no photograph, not even the smallest token of individuality. It is a wardrobe without a life." I assented, for the barrenness of the trunk struck me forcibly. Holmes's lips compressed into that thin line which heralded his deepest concentration. This trunk was intended less to carry Miss Denham's necessities than to persuade others that her journey was in earnest. It is a decoy, Watson, and a clever one. The remark sent a shiver through me, for it implied premeditation of a dark order. Our suspicions, however, were destined to deepen yet further when we encountered her brother. Henry Denham, elder brother of the missing lady, received us that evening in his chambers near Lincoln's Inn. A man of grave and somewhat austere countenance, he spoke with a suppressed intensity that betrayed both affection and anxiety. "Gentlemen," said he, "I cannot doubt that my sister has fallen victim to a conspiracy. For weeks past, she has been the recipient of letters, anonymous, threatening, urging her to abandon her betrothal to Mr. Julian Harrington. They warned of calamity should she persist, though she scorned them as the malice of some unknown enemy." At this, he produced several sheets of coarse paper, upon which rude characters had been scrawled in a disguised hand. The phrases were menacing in their simplicity: "Desist, or suffer the consequence." Holmes examined them with quiet absorption, his brows knitted. "These, Mr. Denham, are not the effusions of idle spite. They form part of a deliberate design." Denham's lips tightened. "Then you believe, as I do, that Clara has been ensnared?" Holmes returned the papers gently. "I believe, sir, that the shadows about your sister are darker than the world supposes. We must trace them to their source." In the days that followed our inquiry at Reading, I observed in my friend a condition of mind which, though not unfamiliar to me, never failed to excite my concern. He was restless to a degree that left him pacing our rooms with abrupt strides, his long fingers interlacing behind his back, his lips compressed into a thin line of concentration. Holmes, when engaged upon a case of importance, could maintain the most imperturbable calm. Yet when the facts eluded him, when some piece of evidence resisted his methodical grasp, he became like a bow strung too taut, vibrating with suppressed energy. He spoke little, and when he did it was in brief clipped phrases, as though he feared that speech itself might dissipate the fragile chain of reasoning forming in his mind. More than once he halted suddenly by the window, staring out upon the fog-dimmed street with a frown so intent that I dared not intrude upon his thoughts. I knew from long experience that this fever of silence boded both frustration and the approach of some fresh insight. Thus, it was with no surprise, yet with mounting curiosity, that I accompanied him when he declared we must question the railway guards anew. We returned together to Paddington, where Holmes requested the attendance of those guards who had been upon duty during the fateful journey. The men assembled with evident reluctance, for their conduct had already come under no small measure of scrutiny, and the presence of my companion seemed to inspire in them both unease and resentment. The first guard, a man of brusque manner, asserted with unwavering confidence that every compartment had been inspected during the course of travel. There was no possibility, he declared, of any passenger disappearing unobserved. I am certain that the lady must have alighted quietly at some intermediate stop. Holmes listened impassively, then turned his attention to the second guard, a younger fellow whose uneasy shifting betrayed a less secure conscience. When questioned, he admitted after some hesitation that his inspection of the compartments had been cursory, and that upon reaching Miss Denham's carriage he had found the door fastened and had not pressed the matter further. "An omission of grave consequence," remarked Holmes coldly, his penetrating eyes fixed upon the man. The guard blanched and stammered, protesting that he believed the compartment to be occupied in privacy and that no harm was intended. Holmes asked no further question, but as we withdrew, I perceived the quiet intensity in his features, which told me he had noted far more in their demeanour than their words revealed. Once clear of the station, Holmes drew me aside with that abrupt energy which heralded an important deduction. His eyes glittered with suppressed conviction as he spoke in low tones. "Do you not perceive, Watson, that the evidence of these men does not merely contradict itself, but reeks of contrivance? The elder asserts a diligence beyond all reason, while the younger betrays both negligence and fear. Between the two of them, truth has been obscured. I tell you plainly, we are not dealing with oversight, but with collusion." I started at the word. "Collusion? You believe, then, that the railway servants were party to the disappearance?" "Precisely so, though whether through bribery, intimidation, or loyalty to another hand I have yet to determine. But mark me, a lady cannot vanish in such fashion without the complicity of those entrusted with her safety. It is no ordinary crime, Watson, but one conceived with daring and executed with aid from within." His voice, though quiet, carried the force of iron certainty. As we returned to Baker Street, I felt the weight of his words settle upon me, for the shadows of the case had grown darker, and the circle of suspicion had widened ominously. That evening, we were visited at Baker Street by Mr. Julian Harrington, the betrothed of Miss Denham. I had expected to see a man bowed with grief, but his appearance was of a different order. He entered with agitation, his hands trembling as he removed his gloves, his eyes shifting continually as though he feared to meet our gaze. Holmes received him with measured courtesy and invited him to recount the particulars of his last communication with Miss Denham. Harrington hesitated, then declared that their parting had been affectionate, though he faltered when pressed to produce her most recent letters. He spoke vaguely of a disagreement which he insisted was of no consequence, yet his evasive manner lent the exchange a curious hollowness. I, observing him closely, was struck by the contradiction between his words and his aspect. His pallor was genuine, his voice shook with evident emotion, and yet there lingered upon him an indefinable air of concealment, as though he withheld some material truth. Holmes, whose penetrating gaze never left him, asked few questions, but I could see that each hesitation was noted and weighed. When at last Harrington departed, murmuring his thanks, Holmes remained silent for a time, his expression betraying nothing. Yet I knew my friend well enough to perceive that suspicion had fastened upon the young man's troubled figure. It was the following morning when a messenger, pale and breathless, arrived at Baker Street with intelligence that chilled my blood. A woman's body had been dragged from the Thames near Chelsea, and the description, though imperfect, bore resemblance to that of Miss Denham. Holmes wasted no moment, and within the hour we stood upon the river bank, where the sombre crowd parted to admit us. The scene was one of grim reality, the grey waters lapping against the wharf, the huddled figures of the curious, and in their midst the still form, shrouded in a sodden garment. I confess that I felt a heaviness in my chest as I gazed upon the pale features, distorted by the water's cruel embrace. Could this indeed be the end of our search, the mystery resolved in death rather than in rescue? Holmes bent low, his hands steady, his eyes sharp as ever. For several tense moments he examined the body with a precision that made the silence unbearable. At last he rose, and the verdict came in that quiet tone which carried authority. "It is not Miss Denham." The effect of those words was like the lifting of a great weight, yet my relief was swiftly tempered by a deeper dread. Clara Denham still lived, but her fate remained enshrouded in peril. The river had yielded no corpse, yet the menace that pursued her was no less real. Holmes, as we turned away from the sombre throng, remarked only, "We have been spared finality, Watson. But mark you, such reprieve is but the herald of a darker play yet to come." His words sank into my heart like a chill, for I knew he spoke the truth. Our inquiries soon brought us once more to the very carriage which Miss Denham had occupied. Holmes's keen eye travelled along its fittings with that restless precision which made no trifle insignificant. Presently he stooped at the window, drawing forth his lens, and motioned me to observe. Upon the inner frame, faint yet distinct when viewed obliquely, were scratches upon the varnished wood, as though some metal implement had been driven against it with hurried force. The brass of the fastening, too, bore fresh abrasions, bright and unweathered, betraying their recent origin. "Note, Watson," Holmes murmured, "how the marks run at an angle, not as one might produce in the ordinary act of opening. They speak of a hand striving against resistance, as though to wrench the fastening in haste." The thought chilled me. That narrow aperture, overlooking the rush of the line, could never have offered safe passage to a passenger, yet in those scratches lay mute witness to an attempt at departure, whether voluntary or compelled. Holmes, straightening himself, tapped the frame lightly. "Here lies the crux, my dear fellow. The door deceives, the luggage misleads, but the window confesses." His tone was grave, and I felt instinctively that this was but the prelude to a darker revelation awaiting us along the rails. Determined to trace the matter further, Holmes obtained from the officials a precise reckoning of the train's passage between Reading and Paddington. With this in hand, we set out upon a desolate stretch of line where the speed was known to slacken between two minor stations. The day was bleak, the winter air sharp against our faces, and the ground damp beneath our boots as we advanced along the embankment. Holmes strode before me, his figure bent with concentration, scanning every yard of gravel and timber with the zeal of a man to whom the earth itself was a ledger awaiting interpretation. To my eyes, the rails stretched monotonously onward, broken only by the occasional culvert or hedgerow. Yet Holmes paused again and again, kneeling to examine some trifling irregularity. A stone displaced, a tuft of grass bent awry. Each time he rose in silence, his face betraying nothing of the conclusions forming within. We must have traversed near a mile when Holmes, with a sudden gesture, arrested my step. "Here, Watson," said he, pointing to the base of a low bridge beneath which the line passed. "Here the ground has been disturbed." I bent down, but could discern only the common litter of the railway. Yet Holmes's tone admitted no doubt. The very air seemed charged with the imminence of discovery. At the spot indicated, the ballast lay in a state which to me appeared natural enough, but which Holmes pronounced otherwise. The gravel was pressed into uneven hollows, as though weight had been borne upon it, while the surrounding dust bore faint streaks not attributable to the passage of the train. "Observe, Watson," he said, directing my gaze with his cane, "how the depression is oblong, and how the edges are fresh and crumbling. Something, or someone, has been lowered here with ropes or arms. The marks of dragging, faint yet certain, lead outward toward that hedge." My heart quickened at the implication. "Then she was cast from the train at this very spot?" I exclaimed. Holmes shook his head. "Not cast, Watson, lowered. Had she been hurled, the force would have shattered bone and left evidence unmistakable. No, she was brought here with care. The intent was not to kill, but to remove. The thought, though relieving in one sense, carried its own horror, for it meant that the abductors possessed a plan at once audacious and deliberate. I felt the grim weight of the crime settle upon me as Holmes moved on with quiet certainty. As we stood beneath the dim arch of the bridge, Holmes allowed his thoughts free utterance. His voice, though low, carried the resonance of conviction. Consider, Watson, what boldness is here displayed. To halt the progress of a life in full view of the public, to remove a lady of fortune from a moving train, and to do so without raising alarm. Such a conception could arise only in the mind of one acquainted intimately with the timetable, the gradients, the very heartbeats of this line. He knew where the train slackens, where watchfulness is relaxed, where concealment is afforded. I listened with growing awe. To plan a crime with such precision spoke of long preparation, perhaps even of knowledge born of employment upon the railway itself. Holmes's eyes flashed with a cold fire. It is not mere chance, Watson. We are opposed by minds of calculation. That makes the task more perilous, but also more certain of solution, for precision leaves traces. The word perilous lingered in my mind, filling me with an unease that deepened as I considered the fate of the poor lady, whose life had been so ruthlessly diverted. As we retraced our steps, I could no longer suppress the dread which had been tightening about my heart. Holmes, I said, if Miss Denham was indeed borne from the train in such a manner, what assurance have we that she yet lives? The river may conceal what the line does not. The veil, the window, the silence of the guards, all point to violence, and violence too often ends in death. My companion regarded me steadily, his expression composed yet touched with gravity. For once, his silence offered no immediate reassurance, and my imagination, unhappily vivid, conjured visions of the young lady lying lifeless in some obscure grave, her fortune the prize of unscrupulous hands. The thought of her brother, waiting with anxious heart for tidings, deepened my dismay. I spoke with more vehemence than was my wont, compelled by the urgency of my fear. I cannot rid myself of the conviction that we pursue but a phantom, Holmes, that the lady is beyond our aid. He placed a hand lightly upon my arm, his eyes kind yet resolute. Courage, Watson. Despair is the enemy's ally. We paused once more upon the embankment, and Holmes, with that calm which so often steadied my faltering spirit, gave voice to his conclusion. No, Watson, said he firmly. Miss Denham lives. Reflect. Her fortune is entailed, her signature essential to its transfer. Dead, she is of little value to her captors. Alive, she is their instrument. The care with which she was lowered, not cast, is proof of their design. I breathed more freely, though a shadow of fear still clung to me. Holmes's reasoning, clear as the river's flow, bore conviction even to my troubled mind. Yet the picture it presented was scarcely less grim, for it condemned her to the hands of conspirators who held her life as hostage to their schemes. Holmes gazed down the line, his profile etched with resolution. Mark me, Watson, she is alive, and while that is so, she may yet be saved. But the net is drawn close about her. We must be swifter still, else she is lost indeed. There was in his words such calm certainty that I felt once again the strange alchemy by which his confidence became my own. The chase was perilous, but the end, I knew, was far from written. Holmes's reflections after our discoveries along the line were long and silent, yet when he did speak, it was with that unerring precision which I had come to recognize as the herald of his most confident deductions. Watson, said he one evening as we sat before the fire, the circle of our inquiry has narrowed to two men. The first is the railway guard, whose testimony bore the unmistakable marks of evasion. His hesitation, his inconsistencies, and his palpable fear betray more than mere negligence. The second is Mr. Julian Harrington, the fiancé of the missing lady, whose grief, though apparent, is alloyed with vagueness and concealment. He spoke of affection, yet faltered when pressed upon details. Such a union of weakness and duplicity is too suggestive to be dismissed. I considered his words with growing unease. You suspect them in concert? Holmes inclined his head. It is not suspicion, but probability. Each has access to what the other lacks, the guard to the movements of the train, Harrington to the confidence of Miss Denham. Together, they form the very machinery by which this plot could be contrived and executed. It is a scheme built not upon chance, but upon collusion. As he uttered the word, I felt the shadow of conspiracy deepen about us, and my heart went out in renewed pity for the unfortunate lady whose life was thus ensnared. Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers steepled, his eyes fixed upon the dancing flames. Consider, Watson, the one constant in all such dramas: motive. Miss Denham's fortune, secured by her late father's estate, lies temptingly within reach of any who might gain control of her person. Harrington, though outwardly prosperous, is rumoured to have met with reverses in speculation. His union with her would restore his credit, and his desperation would lend him to desperate measures. I shuddered at the thought. You believe, then, that his professions of affection are but a mask for avarice? Holmes's lips tightened. Not wholly a mask, perhaps. Men have strangest motives, a blend of passion and cupidity. But mark this: the threatening letters were not the work of chance enemies. They were instruments to shake her resolve, to isolate her, to prepare the ground. Greed lies at the core, Watson. Greed sharpened by ruin. I could not but reflect upon the cruel irony, that love, which should be a lady's safeguard, might become the very snare by which she was undone. Holmes, however, had already turned his mind to the next step of action. The following morning, Holmes dispatched a brief note to one of his acquaintances in the press. That evening's edition of the Globe contained a modest paragraph, tucked discreetly between other items, which declared that the luggage of the missing lady had been opened by officials at Paddington, and that within had been discovered a clue of significance to the police. The notice was couched in vague terms, yet its suggestion was clear enough to those whom it was intended to reach. I remarked upon the stratagem with some surprise. You mean them to betray themselves by their anxiety? I asked. Precisely, Holmes replied. Guilt is the most impatient of counsellors. A false report may sting more sharply than the truth, for it rouses fear of what may yet be revealed. Our quarry, if they are indeed guilty, will move swiftly to protect themselves. And when they move, Watson, we shall follow. I could not repress admiration at the subtlety of his design. It was as though he had cast a stone into a hidden pool and waited for the ripples to betray the shape of what lay beneath. By evening, he had already arranged the role each of us must play. That same night found us in the quiet street where Harrington maintained chambers. Holmes had donned the garb of a humble clerk, a threadbare coat, spectacles, and a shabby hat, so complete in its transformation that I, who knew him best, scarcely recognized him. For my part, I was to remain at a discreet distance, observing such movements as might escape his immediate notice. He took up his position with apparent idleness near the corner, leaning upon a stick like one fatigued by labour, while his keen eyes missed not the faintest stir of the neighbourhood. I marvelled, as I so often did, at his patience, which could rival the stillness of stone when the game demanded silence. Hours crept by, the lamplight flickering upon the damp pavement, when at last the sound of cautious steps drew our attention. Harrington emerged, muffled in a cloak, his features set with anxious resolve. His furtive glances left no doubt that he was bound upon an errand of secrecy. Holmes stirred not, but a faint tightening of his lips betrayed the hunter's anticipation. The moment of revelation was at hand. Harrington had not gone far when another figure joined him from a side street, the railway guard whose testimony had earlier faltered beneath Holmes' scrutiny. The two men exchanged hurried greetings and pressed close together, their voices lowered almost to a whisper. From our vantage, I could catch only the occasional fragment borne upon the night air. Danger must move her before it is too late. The words, though incomplete, struck like a thunderclap upon my mind. I turned to Holmes, whose impassive countenance masked the intensity of his listening. At length, the guard made a gesture of emphasis, to which Harrington responded with a nervous nod. They quickened their pace, casting furtive glances behind them as though pursued by unseen eyes. Holmes touched my arm lightly. "The fish bite, Watson," he murmured. "Let us see to what waters they swim." And so we followed, silent shadows upon their trail, the very fate of Clara Denham hanging upon each step. Through dim and winding streets we pursued them, careful always to keep the interval that concealed us from their notice. At length, they reached the outskirts of London, where the bustle of the city gave way to the solitude of scattered houses and unlit lanes. I marvelled at Holmes's unerring instinct for distance, for though I feared continually that our quarry might detect us, his movements were so precise, his judgment so certain, that they never once looked back to see the danger at their heels. Presently, they turned from the road into a narrow lane that led toward a cluster of buildings half hidden in darkness. From within one of these, there shone a dim and solitary light. The men paused, exchanged a final word, and disappeared within. Holmes laid a hand upon my shoulder, his face illuminated for an instant by the glow of the solitary lamp. "Here, Watson," said he in a whisper of iron calm, "is the end of the thread. Within those walls lies the secret of the vanishing passenger. We shall not disturb them yet, but the trap is ready to spring." With those words, we took our places in the shadows, awaiting the hour of action. At Holmes's signal, we advanced upon the lonely dwelling, its shutters drawn tight against the night. Lestrade had brought with him 2 constables, and together we moved with noiseless precision across the damp grass. Holmes, ever in command, motioned us to our places and himself pressed forward to the door. The lock yielded with surprising ease, and in another instant we stood within the narrow hall. A faint light glimmered from above, while the silence of the house was broken only by the creak of our cautious tread. My heart beat furiously in my breast, for I knew we were upon the very brink of revelation. Holmes ascended first, his movements as quiet as shadow, and we followed close behind. There was no shout, no wasted word, only that concentrated energy which in moments of danger rendered him more formidable than any armed troop. Thus did we enter the upper passage of the house, prepared to meet resistance, and expecting with each step the burst of violence that must attend our intrusion. It was Holmes who thrust open the door at the end of the passage, revealing a chamber dimly lit by a single lamp. There, upon a narrow bed, lay the figure of a young woman, her wrists loosely bound and her head pillowed upon her arm in heavy stupor. I hastened forward, and one glance sufficed to recognize Clara Denham. Her pallor was striking, her lips parched, her breathing shallow, all tokens of some narcotic influence. Yet her pulse, though weak, beat steadily, and I felt a surge of relief to know she lived. Holmes's expression softened, but for an instant as he observed her condition. "Drugged, but not fatally," he said. "She shall recover." Lestrade muttered an oath of indignation at the sight, while the constables busied themselves in freeing her bonds. Clara stirred faintly, murmuring incoherent words, and I could see the shadow of dread that must have haunted her confinement. But even as I bent to reassure her, the sound of sudden movement below warned us that the villains had discovered our approach, and the house was about to resound with their desperate bid for freedom. We had scarcely turned from Miss Denham's side when a crash reverberated from the lower floor, followed by the scuffle of feet upon the boards. Holmes's eyes flashed. "They make for the yard," he cried, and darted down the stairs with Lestrade at his heels. I followed, my revolver in hand, to behold Harrington and the bribed guard struggling fiercely at the rear door, their faces distorted with the frenzy of men cornered. Seeing us, They made a sudden dash toward the window, but Holmes had anticipated their move. The bolts upon the shutters had already been fixed from without, and the yard swarmed with constables summoned secretly by Holmes earlier in the evening. Trapped, the conspirators turned like beasts at bay, their rage lending them momentary strength. Harrington struck wildly with a stick, while the guard hurled himself bodily against the door. But the struggle was brief. Holmes, agile as ever, wrenched the weapon from Harrington's grasp, while Lestrade's men bore down upon the other. In another instant both were subdued, panting and furious, yet helpless in the iron grip of justice. With practiced swiftness, the handcuffs were snapped upon the wrists of Harrington and his accomplice. Lestrade, his face stern with official satisfaction, recited their offences with a curt finality that left no doubt of their fate. Harrington, his handsome features now disfigured by despair, sank into sullen silence, while the guard muttered incoherently of promises and necessity. Their bravado had fled, leaving only the hollow wreckage of guilt exposed. Holmes regarded them coldly. "You plotted with care," said he, "but precision is its own betrayer. A single scratch upon a window frame has undone you both." At this, Harrington raised his head with a glare of impotent fury, but the constables dragged him forth, and the echo of the doors closing seemed the knell of their conspiracy. When we returned to the chamber above, Clara Denham had revived somewhat under the influence of fresh air and the restoratives I applied. She gazed at us with eyes still clouded by weakness, yet alight with dawning comprehension. "You have saved me," she whispered faintly, her hands trembling as they clasped mine. Then, turning her gaze to Holmes, she added with touching earnestness, "And you, sir, you read the truth when all others doubted." Holmes inclined his head gravely, but made no reply beyond a brief assurance that her ordeal was at an end. I could perceive, however, that beneath his calm exterior lay a silent satisfaction at having plucked a life from the jaws of cruelty. Thus ended that perilous night, with the captive restored to liberty and her captors consigned to justice, though the shadows of their scheme still lingered ominously in my thoughts. It was with a sense of profound relief that I found myself once more within the familiar walls of Baker Street. The fire glowed warmly in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the crowded shelves and littered tables, where manuscripts, chemical flasks, and the odds and ends of Holmes' peculiar studies lay scattered. After the tumult of the preceding hours, the quiet of that room fell upon me like a benediction. Holmes had thrown himself into his armchair with the air of one who has completed a task of magnitude, while I, still stirred by the memory of Miss Denham's peril, found solace in the simple comfort of home. Yet I knew my friend well enough to perceive that his repose was but the outer shell of a mind still keenly engaged. Presently, with a spark in his eye, he began to unravel the tangle of motives that had led us thus far. Holmes commenced with the calm precision that was his habit when reviewing a solved case. "Harrington," said he, "was a man outwardly of some fortune and standing, but beneath that veneer lay ruin. His speculations in foreign loans had collapsed, his creditors pressed upon him, and his only salvation lay in the wealth of his intended bride. To gain her inheritance by honest marriage was too slow for his need. To secure it by coercion offered him swifter relief." I listened with growing indignation, for I recalled the man's pale features and faltering tones when he had spoken of his betrothed. Holmes continued inexorably. He believed that by isolating her, by placing her in his power, he could force her to compliance. A signature wrung by fear or weakness would suffice to replenish his coffers. His passion, such as it was, had become the mask of greed, and greed was the true master of his actions. The revelation of Harrington's duplicity deepened my sympathy for Miss Denham, who had trusted her heart to one so utterly unworthy. Holmes next turned his discourse to the second conspirator. The guard, whose equivocations so soon betrayed him, furnished the indispensable link. Without knowledge of the line, the points where the train slackened speed, the secrecy of its passages, the scheme could never have been accomplished. For a price, and Carrington had still enough credit to supply that, the man sold both his duty and his conscience. I recalled vividly the fellow's shifting eyes and trembling hands when first questioned. It was plain enough, even to my less trained observation, that he bore upon him the burden of deceit. His task, Holmes concluded, was to feign diligence while ensuring that suspicion was lulled. In truth, he was the custodian of absence. He made it possible that a passenger might vanish from a moving train without the alarm that should have followed instantly. Holmes leaned back and joined his fingertips, as was his custom in moments of review. The luggage, Watson, was the simplest yet most effective of deceptions. The untouched trunk, securely locked and containing garments of no consequence, gave the impression that its owner remained aboard. It diverted both guard and fellow passengers from perceiving her absence until the train had reached its terminus, by which time her captors were well beyond pursuit. The stratagem, once revealed, struck me with its ingenuity, though it was ingenuity bent to a vile purpose. Holmes's eyes rested upon me with a faint gleam. In criminal enterprise, as in chess, it is often the pawn that distracts from the checkmate. The trunk was the pawn, harmless in itself but decisive in its effect. Another matter, Holmes continued, was the series of anonymous communications which so disquieted the lady. They bore all the hallmarks of invention, vague in substance, yet calculated to instill dread. It was Carrington who penned them, adopting a hand sufficiently disguised to elude recognition. Their purpose was twofold: to weaken her resolve by terror, and to isolate her from friends who might otherwise have protected her. I could not repress a shudder at the perfidy thus disclosed. To cloak villainy beneath the semblance of concern, to frighten the very woman one professed to love. It was a cruelty which surpassed common vice. Holmes, however, spoke of it without passion, as one who had long reconciled himself to the darker recesses of human nature. "They were but rehearsals, Watson," said he quietly. "The letters prepared the stage upon which the abduction would be played." At last Holmes drew together the scattered strands of the investigation. "The veil torn upon the seat," said he, "spoke of sudden disturbance, the involuntary snatch of fabric in a moment of alarm. The smear upon the window latch betrayed the forcible opening of the casement, the very portal by which she was removed. The false testimony of the guards, contradictory and evasive, revealed complicity within. And lastly, the behaviour of Carrington himself, his vagueness, his reluctance to produce her letters, his ill-concealed agitation, furnished the human element which no object could supply. He paused, his gaze fixed upon the smoke curling upward from his pipe. Piece by piece, Watson, the mosaic took shape. Each trifle, considered alone, might seem inconsequential. Yet together, they formed a pattern so precise that doubt became impossible. Carrington's guilt was written as plainly as though upon the page of an open ledger. I could not but marvel anew at the clarity of his reasoning. To me, the affair had been a whirl of perplexities. To Holmes, it was but a page to be deciphered, a cipher whose key lay always in the patient observation of fact. The tumult of our late adventure had scarcely subsided when I found myself once again seated in the familiar chair opposite Holmes at Baker Street. The fire burned with steady cheer in the grate, casting a glow upon the crowded shelves and the curious relics of past inquiries that surrounded us. How strange it seemed that within these tranquil walls, the memories of peril, pursuit, and sudden violence should already appear as though distant echoes. Holmes reclined in his armchair, pipe in hand, his expression composed, yet far from idle. To outward appearance, he might have been a man at rest, soothed by the comfort of home, but I knew well that behind those keen grey eyes, his mind still ranged among the shadows of the case, disentangling its moral fibres as carefully as he had its physical clues. For myself, the quiet of the hearth offered welcome contrast to the grim images still vivid before me. The lonely house, the bound figure of Miss Denham, the fury of the cornered villains. Yet I felt also that our vigil by the fire, was but the fitting epilogue to an affair that had tested alike our courage and our compassion. It was Holmes who first broke the silence, speaking in that reflective tone which marked his rare descents into the philosophy of human conduct. "There is no snare, Watson, so perilous as that which is woven from the threads of love and avarice combined. Either, alone, is dangerous enough, but together they form a labyrinth wherein the heart itself becomes the traitor." I listened attentively, struck by the gravity of his words. "Harrington doubtless felt some sentiment for the lady," Holmes continued, "but it was not love pure and unalloyed. It was affection poisoned by self-interest, and so it became but another instrument of greed. Men speak often of dangers that lurk in dark alleys or in the wilderness of crime, but I tell you, Watson, the human heart, when warped by avarice, is a peril greater than any knife or pistol." His eyes, fixed upon the fire, glowed with the intensity of the thought. "It is greed, not hatred, that drives the boldest schemes, and it cloaks itself in the most seductive guises." Here we saw how a woman's trust, her very capacity for affection, was turned into the lever by which her ruin was attempted. I could not but feel the sombre truth of his words. In the days that followed, I often recalled with deep admiration the bearing of Miss Denham. Though her strength had been sorely tried, and her nerves shaken by captivity, she endured her ordeal with a quiet fortitude that bespoke both dignity and character. When first we found her, pale and weakened by drugs, I feared she might never recover the poise that had once adorned her life. Yet, as her strength returned, I observed in her an admirable resolve to face the world without bitterness. There was in her gratitude a sincerity untainted by self-pity, and in her composure a grace that no cruelty could efface. It is not the triumph of Holmes's intellect alone that marks this case in my memory, but the resilience of a woman who, though nearly undone by treachery, emerged with her spirit unbroken. The scars of such a trial must linger, yet I am persuaded that her courage will stand her in stead for the trials yet to come. As I mused upon these things, I could not refrain from expressing to Holmes my admiration for the foresight that had guided his every action. From the stratagem in the newspapers to the timely securing of every exit at the house, his calculations had seemed touched with a prescience bordering upon the miraculous. He waved my praise aside with the modesty which, in him, was ever allied to truth. "You mistake, Watson," said he quietly. "There is no miracle in it. Method, patience, and an eye trained to note trifles, these suffice. Where others perceive confusion, I but read a page whose characters are faint, yet legible. The rest is perseverance." I smiled, for though his words were sincere, they scarcely diminished my wonder. To me, his reasoning remained as marvellous as the keen instinct of a hound upon the scent, though I knew he would have scorned the comparison. His dismissal of his own genius only deepened my conviction that it was genius indeed. Holmes fell into silence again, and when next he spoke, it was with a note of melancholy that I seldom heard from him. "You may be assured, Watson, that this is not the last such scheme that shall cross our path. Human envy, human greed, and human delusion, these are inexhaustible springs. Strike them down in one place, and they reappear in another, as weeds in a neglected garden." There was in his voice no weariness, but rather a recognition of the unending struggle. "I sometimes think," he added softly, "that we are but lanterns carried for a brief while through a darkness which is never wholly dispelled. For each Clara who is rescued, there are others who go unheeded." The words struck me with their quiet sadness, and I felt anew the depth of his perception. Holmes, who so often seemed absorbed only in the puzzle, carried within him a sombre understanding of the frailty of human virtue and the persistence of human vice. It lent to his victories a gravity that I had sometimes overlooked. Yet, as I set down this chronicle, I cannot end upon so despondent a note. For though crime may return, so also does the vigilance that meets it. And in Sherlock Holmes, the world has one who, though he claims only method and reason, brings to the defense of the innocent a constancy and courage beyond measure. I recall him now, pipe in hand, the faintest smile upon his lips as he remarked, "It is enough, Watson, that for one night the shadows were beaten back. So may it ever be, for while such a sentinel keeps watch upon the crooked paths of man, there is hope yet that truth shall prevail over falsehood, and justice over the designs of those who would betray both love and honour." Holmes leaned back in his chair, the glow of the fire casting shifting patterns across his face. "You see, Watson," he said thoughtfully, "the disappearance itself was never the true enigma. Any passenger may be concealed or removed by force. The real mystery lies in the human heart, how love, when poisoned by greed, may become a snare more fatal than any chain." I pondered his words, struck as ever by the quiet depth behind his reasoning. What do you think, dear listener? Was Carrington's greatest mistake his crime upon the rails, or the betrayal of the woman who trusted him? If you enjoyed unravelling this mystery, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes stories to puzzle and delight. Perhaps a friend or family member would enjoy following the trail with you. Share it with them and let the game continue.